welcome to tonight's discussion of the proposed Minneapolis Public Safety Charter Amendment. My name is Tim Marks. I've been a downtown resident, my wife and I, for 11 years now, and I'm the former president and CEO of Catholic Charities, and am now president emeritus. I want to thank our two discussants. I'll introduce them more later, Janae Bates and Steve Cramer. And I'd like to tell you how we'll proceed tonight. First, I want to let you know that this Zoom call, this discussion, is being recorded and will be available later tonight in some format or tomorrow on the website, where you can look for it then. Here's how we're going to proceed. We're going to give 15 minutes to the proponent of the charter amendment, Janae Bates, 15 minutes to the opponent of it, Steve Cramer, and then you'll have the opportunity to put questions in chat. And I will choose questions and moderate this so that it can be a good discussion. This is not a debate. We're hoping to keep it a discussion. I do want to let you know that I do have a long-term professional relationship with Steve Cramer. I was on the Downtown Council board for several years and just rolled off this spring. And Steve is currently on the Catholic Charities board. We informed Janae of this, and she consented to my continuing to moderate. So before we turn it over and I introduce our two discussants, what I thought I would do, just for clarification's sake, is actually read the proposed amendment. You can go onto the city website, and it is on the website as well. This is the language now approved by the Minneapolis City Council. It reads as follows. Question number 2. Shall the Minneapolis City Charter be amended to strike and replace the police department with the Department of Public Safety, which could include licensed peace officers, police officers, if necessary, with the administrative authority to be consistent with other city departments to fulfill its responsibility for public safety. That is the wording of the amendment on which Minneapolis voters will be voting this fall. To begin our discussion, we have Janae Bates, who is the communications director with Yes for Minneapolis, the organization that has been sponsoring and proposing the charter amendment. Renee is also the communications director for Faith in Minnesota, which is an affiliate of Isaiah, a faith-based advocacy organization. She has a background in journalism, theology, ministry, and teaching, and was a Fulbright scholar. Welcome, Janae. I will introduce Steve later. Janae, you have 15 minutes to make the case for the proposed amendment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thanks everyone for really getting involved and wanting to learn more about a really important issue that we all get to vote on together. All right, so once again, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. I am Minister Janae Bates. I use she, her pronouns. I am the communications director with Yes for Minneapolis. I am also the co-lead of the campaign, and I am incredibly excited to get to talk to you all about something that's really important and exciting that we get to do and create and be together. And so this is really about expanding our public safety when we're talking about issue number 2 on the ballot. And so first, I really want to have a grounding conversation about why it's even important. We as a state in the Twin Cities, and most certainly in Minneapolis, have been through a lot in just the last 13, 14, 15 months now. And most certainly, all of these things did not happen in a silo. We know we went through a pandemic. We also witnessed the murder of George Floyd. We also were through the racial uprising. We also were with each other through all these things. And so what we have learned through this really impactful experience is that we, the collective we, are the ones who need to keep us safe. And that includes all of us and all of our acumen and wisdom and tools. And I really want to ground us there first. I think it's just incredibly important when we talk about possibility and the things that we can have and the things we actually deserve to have together. And so when we talk about Minneapolis, we talk about a city that is truly in need of healing, safety, and unity. And that is most certainly what we set out to do with this charter amendment. And so to remember, the people of Minneapolis are able to and deserve to move away from armed police only responses to directly address violence in community, and to do so now, to get to the root of violence and crime, decreasing it, to embrace a holistic model of public safety. That means that we are actually concerned about the whole person, the humanity of all people within this city, to fund, resource, and support trained, qualified professionals, the people we trust to keep us safe, to have citywide representation and accountability with those who protect and serve, and most certainly to do this in a racially equitable way. It sounds like a lot, right? We deserve it and we get to have it. And that is most certainly the most exciting thing about it. But we're all like, yeah, that all sounds great and lovely and wonderful, but that's not what I'm feeling. That's not what's manifested right now. And so we actually need to talk about how we got here, how we got to the point where we even need to make this happen, which means we have to have some honesty, right, and integrity about where we are. So the Minneapolis Police Department has been around for over 150 years in the city of Minneapolis. And it has, in that 150 years, gone through many, many, many reforms. It is what many people would call the poster child for reforms. And so we mean that the people of the Minneapolis Police Department and the department, the container of the Minneapolis Police Department, has experienced trainings on de-escalation, implicit bias trainings, mental health trainings. They have instituted using body cameras. They have a series of attempts at having civilian oversight of MPD, which have determined to be ineffective. So these bodies usually don't have any teeth. And they've just been completely dismantled by the police department and the Federation over time. The Department of Public Justice has had to make several interventions already. They did so in '93, they did it again in 2016, and now we know that they are going to do it again this year. It's actually already begun. And that even with many personnel changes, new cadets, reform-minded police chiefs who have been committed to making these big changes, these real big cultural shifts that need to happen within the institution. Folks like Tony Boza, Police Chief Janae Hartu, and even our current police chief, Chief Arredondo. And we also know that the problem still remains. So that means that something isn't working. We have to have, again, an honest conversation about how we got here and what we can have and do and be together. Those police chiefs, those cadets, all of those who have been a part of the Minneapolis Police Department have also said several times over that they have been responding to far more things than they should be, that they actually don't have the tools, the training, the experience, and neither should they, to do all of the things that they're being called on to do. And so the people of Minneapolis, the people in the Twin Cities, in greater Minnesota, in the United States, in the world, came together when we all witnessed a murder. And we mourned together, we grieved together, we lifted our hands in peaceful protest. We also experienced a police department that was, instead of taking that opportunity to grieve and mourn with us, did not do so. And we were actually greeted with more violence. And then we saw more and more violence. And even when the current chief and the mayor, who has total and complete control over the police department right now, when they said, please stop lambasting these people with tear gas and rubber bullets, they didn't stop. When our own governor asked them to stop, they didn't stop. And that was a clear indication for all of us that there's a breach in the oath to protect and serve, but that we don't have to keep making that choice, that we can actually have accountability. And so the people of Minneapolis, people across race and region and income, they came together, coalitions of residents, neighbors, small businesses, faith communities, organizations, folks in Minneapolis federations of teachers, educators, health workers. They were like, you know what? It's time that we create something new, that we actually stop admiring the problem and do something about it. And so that is where Yes for Minneapolis began. And so in the frigid cold of January, and you all know what that's like, in Minnesota, folks knocked on doors, they talked to their neighbors, they said, we're ready. We're ready to actually say, you know what, we're not just going to say Black Lives Matter. We're going to prove it. We're going to prove it in policy. We're going to prove it that we're going to make sure that our communities are safe. And so that's how this amendment began. 22,000 people signed that amendment. We had a validated over 14,000 people in the city of Minneapolis ready to say, let's do this. And so what does that mean? What does this whole charter amendment mean? What does number 2 on the ballot mean? Well, it means that we get to have a public safety department that will replace the current container of the Minneapolis Police Department, which allows us to have the ability to finally replace this police-only model of public safety that we've been using that's really outdated. And if we were all really having an honest conversation, we don't know if it actually was dated to begin with. It allows us to be both proactive and responsive so that people get the help they need and it is the right size response when they're in crisis, and that we get to actively attack the big issues that we know we face, the big issues that the city has been facing for a long time, long before 2020, long before 2018, long before 19. However, these are things that we get to tackle together, which means we're doing this in a public health approach. This is about the public. People's lives being lost, that is just not something that we can continue to be willy-nilly about or think about it as that, oh, we hope it solves itself, or we'll keep doing the same thing that has given us the same results. We get to look at people as a holistic person, which gives us the opportunity to use a mix of different strategies and types of staff, including trained mental health workers, crisis specialists, emergency responders, and police officers when we need them. We get to have all of those things. This creates a flexibility in staffing and budgeting. Right now, the city charter is so rigid that we actually don't have the ability to make these kind of changes. It creates an oversight and accountability that includes citywide representation. Currently, the Minneapolis Police Department is the only department that has one person who is the oversight and not the entire representation of the city. And so that one person currently is the mayor. But we do have the opportunity to finally have this department match the rest of the departments in the city that don't get global headlines about abuse and murder. So just so you can all kind of get a glimpse of what I mean when I say that, on your left, you see the current system that is set up in the Minneapolis Police Department. I know there is a continued conversation, and Tim, I think, lifted this up earlier, but that, you know, that there's this idea that we might want to start a mayoral control system in the city of Minneapolis. And so while all of the departments of the city are set up differently to have the citywide representation, the current police department is an anomaly in that. It is set apart from all the other departments where, as a matter of fact, we get to see what a mayoral control system looks like, because that's what we have in the police department, in the Minneapolis Police Department. And so he gets to be the executive chief, or she, if that ever had changed, but that person gets to be the one to have total control as it currently stands. And so when we're looking at what we can actually create, this allows full representation of the city, because we also know the way that Minneapolis is set up is that technically a mayor really only needs to win about 3 wards in the whole city, unfortunately, because of how disenfranchisement and misrepresentation happens. And so in order to ensure that the people of every ward gets to have a fair say, gets to actually be a part of making sure that the mechanisms that keep them safe are there, then you can have full representation. And then they appoint a department commissioner. And then that person would then be over the actual Department of Public Safety. And again, that department can include a wide variety of all the tools that we need, that we already have in the city, the experts and professionals, and we can train them up and we can make sure that they are ready and prepared to handle the things that we need them for. That also includes police officers.
So, about 2 minutes, Janae.
Got it. Thank you. So why do we need to change the charter? Why can't we do this right now? Sadly, the charter has been set up in a particular way in 1961, where the Police Federation and the mayor of that day, they struck a deal in which it said that we have to have a certain number of officers and that they get to hold on to what is equivalent to 35% of the city budget. And it has to be armed police only within that department. And so we don't have the flexibility currently to do the things that we always say are the solutions when bad things happen. And so this is not something that we have to keep accepting. It is not something that's impossible to create this new department. We get to do it, and it's on the ballot. But I have heard that this is about abolishing the police. We have to have a conversation grounded in reality. The fact is that this is actually about expanding public safety so that we can have more of what we need to keep us safe. We get to use all the tools, and that's police included. As a matter of fact, in the state of Minnesota, it is mandated, it is in our statute, that police officers must handle certain things full stop anyway. And so we will have police. That is a fact. And so there's not a lot of grounded reality in this notion that police will go away. We actually get to use them in a smarter, safer, and more disciplined way. So if you're sitting there and you're like, I'm in, this sounds amazing. How can I help? How can I be a part of this multiracial democracy that we are creating and going to keep one another safe? You can volunteer. There is the Mobilize link. I'll also put that in the chat in a moment, where you can friend bank and phone bank and door knock with us. You can hold a house meeting. So please reach out if you're interested in doing that. And please follow us on social. We are most certainly always holding space. I see I timed myself. Holding space in time. But
go ahead, finish up. You have final thoughts, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is an opportunity for us to really get to do this together. And most certainly the world is watching. They're looking to see, are they really going to follow through and do something, or are they going to continue status quo? And while it's great that we get to lead the nation in this model that is beautiful and amazing, it's also, we've seen it work before in other places, but in small ways, we can get it to scale. And the most important thing is that it's about keeping one another safe. We get to do it together. Thank you. And I'll also, just so you have it, I can also put my email in the chat for everyone as well.
All right. Well, Janae, thank you very much for that thorough presentation. I'd like to introduce Steve Kramer now, who is the president of the Minneapolis Downtown Council and Business Improvement District. He assumed that position in 2013. Steve spent 10 years on the city council. He also ran the Minneapolis Community Development Agency, the development function. He had a similar position with the county. And he also was executive director of the nonprofit called Project for Pride in Living, which has a significant presence in Minneapolis. Steve, thank you for being here. and express what I expect to be a different point of view. And you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. And thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight. And I want to thank Minister Bates as well for her presentation. And we agree on this. The status quo in our community is unacceptable, and safety for all is the ultimate goal. But we come at those imperatives, Tim, as you suggest, from a very different perspective. So I thought I would start tonight by relaying a recent conversation I had with a downtown resident. For all I know, he's on the call tonight. I wrote a commentary on July 28th outlining my reasons for opposing the Yes for More amendment. And during the course of this conversation, we talked about that. And during the conversation, this individual said and made the comment, "I agree with your position, but you haven't persuaded me yet," which I thought was an interesting way to frame a dialogue. And the reason I hadn't persuaded him, even though he agreed with my conclusion that the amendment was not wise, is that he felt my column did not reflect the deep and righteous pain our community has felt since the murder of George Floyd and all the ensuing events. And so we discussed that pain, and the pain he was thinking about was the pain felt by people of color due to systemic racism in the police department and other institutions, and the way that's manifested in our community. And he was right. And so we talked about kind of the reform work that has to happen within MPD, and that is happening under the chief's leadership, of new use of force policy, recently limiting traffic stops, very high use, much greater use of body cameras, which I actually find to be a positive thing, and a new field training program, recruit classes to bring in different, younger, more diverse officers. And in addition, I brought to the table many initiatives the business community is involved in, setting up a community safety innovation fund and funding it, pro bono legal help from a major law firm to help with arbitration cases so that officers who shouldn't be on the force stay off the force, and other things. So reform is underway. It continues, and it must continue, but there are many things happening to try to address that form of pain inflicted by the police department. But I also talked about other layers of pain, the pain of lost businesses and livelihoods and access to services throughout the city, which goes on still today for many people in many areas of Minneapolis. Lost economic opportunity and opportunity for investment and new employment growth and tax-based growth to pay for the services we need because of uncertainty about the safety environment and commitment to future safety, given the defund and disband policing announcements that started at Powderhorn Park last June, and that continuing rhetoric along those lines over the subsequent months. And the very real pain of people, especially people of color, experiencing a significant increase in crime in our city. Violent crime is up 23% since 2020 to date, compared to the previous 3-year average. It's been a 125% increase in monthly gunshot wound victims since 2020 compared to the past years. 409 alone in this year, and 86% of those victims are people of color. 48 homicides by firearms so far this year. 90% of those victims are people of color. A rash of carjackings, exhibition driving that takes over whole intersections and turns deadly. And I think we all know what this experience has been. So there is real pain in our community at many different layers, and we have to work together to find the best way forward. I don't believe it is the Yes for Minneapolis Charter Amendment. Here's what I think we need to do. For our entire community to be safe, we need an effective, trusted, and accountable police department. Our force is dramatically depleted and needs to be rebuilt under the chief's leadership. I support the authorized strength of a department at 888 sworn officers, which many council members and groups supporting Yes for Minneapolis did not during last year's budget process. And I think we all know we aren't anywhere near that today. We're probably in the low 600s. In terms of officers who are coming to work every day, which drives us near the bottom of per capita officer count for any large city in the country. Now, one of the issues raised by the Yes for Minneapolis campaign and the key organizations driving it, Reclaim and Black Visions, is this ideology of police abolition. And I heard Minister Bates say that that's not what this amendment is about. But the leaders of those key organizations couldn't be more clear. That's what they believe. And this amendment for them is a step down that road in their view. That's not right for Minneapolis, not now, not ever. But in the immediate term, the practical issue will be whether and how we begin to build back a depleted department. And I don't think that will happen if the amendment is passed. And what the future is beyond the immediate term, the rest of this year and next year, will be a huge question if this amendment passes, which will shake the confidence of many, many people. For our entire community to be safe, we need to support a reform-minded, trusted chief of police, and that is Medario Arredondo. This charter amendment eliminates his department and his job. It couldn't be more clear. That's what happens. And under state law, Minnesota Statute 410-12, Subdivision 4, the amendment, if it passes, has to be put into effect within 30 days. So Rondo's last day as chief, and you can mark your calendar, would be December 3rd of this year. Now, again, I hear, oh, that's not what we really mean. That's not what we intend. Rondo can still be chief, and maybe that's true. But even if it were true, it wouldn't be the same job. Chief of what? Reporting to a new boss, who in turn reports now to 14 bosses, all within 30 days. I'll just restate what I wrote in July. To me, with crime rising throughout Minneapolis and the imperative to reform policing a top priority, it seems like a terrible time to not have a chief of police. Rondo's not a singular shining knight. He'd be the first to say that. But he is the leader we need at this time and should not be undermined. And for our community to be safe, a reformed, rebuilt, more trusted and accountable MPD must be part of a continuum of public safety responses, much like the system that has been built downtown with business community dollars, with a range of integrated programs from street outreach workers and street level activation to a professional social worker who's on our team to respond to mental health and addiction issues, all integrated with law enforcement, working cooperatively together. Now, the city, to their credit, has started down that path already. This amendment is not necessary for this to occur because it's already occurring. And in my view, the amendment will actually complicate, not facilitate this needed work. So I wrote in my amendment, there are really a number of reasons in my commentary, number of reasons not to support this amendment. Got a no chief, I've addressed that. Got a no reform. The reform work is happening, but the Yes for Minneapolis campaign really isn't about that. It is about this sort of undefined vision of a public safety department, which brings me to my next no, a no plan. It seems intentional. There's no plan for what this department really might be like, which reminds me of the debate our nation has had over healthcare policy, where for the longest time we heard from people who oppose the Affordable Care Act, ideologically, we don't like this. Ideologically, the Yes for Minneapolis folks don't like the police department. The folks that don't like the ACA, let's just get rid of it. Folks who don't like the MPD, let's just get rid of that department. No plan, but trust us, it's going to be great. We heard that a lot in the context of ACA, and we're hearing it now again in this debate. And I think this is kind of a risk that we really can't run as a community. No need, I mentioned that, the work of integrating and developing beyond policing strategies and integrating them with law enforcement is occurring can occur, this amendment is not necessary. Kind of no safety for the reasons that I mentioned, and no transparency. Tim, the question that you read earlier is a shadow of the question that was originally approved by our city council and mayor, along with an explanatory note that would help the citizens understand what they're voting on. Because of a lawsuit by Yes for Minneapolis, we now have that very limited, I think, insufficient description of this ballot question. And let me just take a couple of minutes to respond quickly to some of the information that Minister Bates provided. I have heard this argument that 35% of the city budget is devoted to the police department. Again, I think a better metric is to look at kind of our per capita count of officers. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very low in relationship to other communities. And one of the reasons that 35% figure exists is that the city of Minneapolis budget only contains some of the things that our property tax dollars pay for. I pay property taxes, and you do too, to Hennepin County and to the school district. And if you look at the totality of services that we pay for that address some of the objectives around long-term solutions and beyond policing strategies, that 35% would shrink dramatically. Again, a better measure is our per capita count, and we are very, very low. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I perhaps haven't used quite all of my 15 minutes, but that will give us a few more minutes for questions. Again, my perspective, no chief, no reform, no plan, no need, no safety, no transparency, no on question 2. Thank you very much. I look forward to the opportunity to respond to questions.
Thank you very much, Steve, for those comments. Now it is kind of your turn. I'm monitoring the chat, and I'm getting some help from Max Erickson, who's on the board, to kind of feed and read those and summarize some questions. And so I'm going to ask you, as you put your questions in chat, to make them very brief so that Max can summarize them for me, and to refrain from kind of long comments because that will kind of help our discussion. Those would be, I think, useful kind of perhaps later as this discussion unfolds throughout the community. I guess as I was not monitoring the chat, I guess I will pose one question to each of you, and then first let Janae respond. And it speaks to the cultural issues, which are, if all of the things that Minister Janae pointed out haven't resulted in success, and Steve, you have remarked that there's been a lot of efforts as well, but we still have a long way to go. What is more necessary in the culture of violence and guns or other things, regardless of what happens here? Could you comment a little bit about the broader perspective? And again, Janae, if you would start out with that. You're muted, Janae. You can unmute yourself. Does Janae need help unmuting herself? Christy, are you on that? Yeah, Janae can't unmute herself. There we are. The wonders of Zoom. No worries.
Mute rights had been taken. All right, I'm sorry. Tim, do you mind rephrasing that question or repeating it?
There was a question in the chat that spoke to what your comments were. A lot of things have happened, but it hasn't yielded the result which we want in this community. Mm-hmm. Safer, more equitable, racially just.
Yeah.
Steve basically admitted that. So the questioner basically said, regardless of what happens here, what needs to happen culturally beyond the four corners of this amendment and what it proposes, with the culture of violence, with guns and other things that can put this perhaps question in broader context. And I thought, Janae, you might be the first responder to that kind of concept.
Sure, absolutely. So what we know about safe communities, and that's nationwide, is that safe communities are resourced communities. That's a full stop, right? So that means that it is far beyond just our policing that needs to be addressed. As you mentioned, we're also talking about what happens in community And the reality is that when communities, the people who live in communities, the safest communities in America, those look like people have livable wages. That looks like they have sick time. That looks like they have quality free education. That looks like they have places to be sheltered and have warm food and have a roof over their heads, and that they have their basic needs met. That means they have plenty of access to healthcare, including mental health. They most certainly have someone who responds to them when they are having a drug substance issue. They have the right size response when they are in crisis, and that it's not just that immediate intervention, that they have the resources and the long-term care that gets them to a real place of healing and wholeness. And so we know that to be true across race, that those are the communities that are the safest. And so what Minneapolis gets to do with this charter change is take that first step of saying that we're going to look at this in a holistic way, that we're not just going to tackle this really big problem with a hammer. We're actually going to use all of our tools and tackle it in a way that centers people, centers their humanity, their dignity, their agency. And it actually looks at the whole person, the whole family, the whole community, the whole neighborhood. And that we're not going to, cherry pick issues. We're not going to say, well, this is your fault, your individual fault. You need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That's a horrible thing to tell someone, especially when they don't have boots, right? And so it is really about all of us taking this seriously and working together to get it done. But that is a great question to the closer.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to offer some comments?
Well, I would just build off Minister Bates' last question. My favorite Martin Luther King quote is, "It is a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps." And Tim, as you know, I've spent a big chunk of my career working on those very kind of underlying long-term solutions, whether it's affordable housing or job training or education, just any number of things. Through all that work, though, safety of communities, safety of neighborhoods was central to success, as was economic vibrancy, having a strong economy that could create opportunities that we could work to kind of attach people to. And my concern, again, is that our community is not as safe as it should be for anyone right now. This amendment will not help us move in that direction. And consequently, in my view, in my experience, those longer term underlying very important investments and solutions for people will not be as successful as they otherwise would be.
Thank you, Steve. So I just want to remind everybody, we're at 7:42 right now. Since we did get a little bit later start, we'll probably go to about 8:10, no longer than 8:15. Our guests have agreed to stay that long. I also been asked to remind you that there's one other related charter amendment, amendment number 1, that would basically change the government structure to give mayoral control over more city departments. And there was a discussion of that last night. So I think as this community discussion unfolds, people will be talking about Amendment 1, which is the mayoral control or charter change to change the structure of a city government. Second, the public safety environment, and there'll be a third regarding rent control. That'll be number 3. That might be kind of helpful context for you. There's been a number of questions posed now that said, what are we learning from other cities and other communities that have taken this approach or are considering this approach? What models out there that perhaps we can learn some things from, that they've tried it hasn't worked, they've tried it works very well, or it's being considered? Steve, do you want to respond to that first if you have any perspective on that? And then Janae, will turn it over to you.
Well, I guess a couple of thoughts come to mind. I'll be brief because I want to reserve plenty of time for Janae and other questions. But 2 things come to mind, Tim, in response to that question. One, I've been part of a community coalition formed by a former CEO and a former U.S. attorney called Coalition to Transform. And one of the resources that has been brought to the city, specifically for Chief Arredondo, is the former police chief of Camden, New Jersey, who kind of many people point to as an example of this sort of comprehensive reform of the police department. I mean, the point that he will make is that this is not a resource detraction issue. This is a resource increase issue in order to affect the kind of change in a police department to make it more just, more trusted, more effective. So that's one thought that comes to mind. The other is, and I'll go back to a point I made earlier, it's kind of comprehensive weaving together of multiple safety related strategies, law enforcement, community outreach, kind of making available services for people who are experiencing mental health and other kinds of life crises, is something that we've been doing downtown in Minneapolis for well over a decade through the Downtown Improvement District. And frankly, many communities come here to look at that example. So again, we do that under current charter, current law, current practice. It can be done. It doesn't require this charter amendment that I think has other negative consequences. So kind of those are the two things that come to mind when you ask me that question.
Okay. Janae, lessons learned where this came from and how you perhaps have seen it play out or would like to see it play out in other communities?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that we have gotten to do in the city of Minneapolis and the Twin Cities and across Minnesota is we have studied the problem big time. And not just for the past 10 years, as, I appreciate Steve Cramer, your work in doing that for the past 10 years. It's actually been a lot longer than that, right? And as, Steve Cramer mentioned, he's been doing a lot of this like intervention work, working with police officers, pulling in other qualified professionals. And we have been doing that in a piecemeal way. And when you look at, for example, we have a Department of Violence Prevention, which sounds amazing. And they really worked magic, made it happen on a shoestring budget and with very little power. But what we also have seen is many, many different programs and projects just like that all across the country work. Again, being in a siloed way, being, like a one-off, or in our particular case, even in Minneapolis, in the midst of emergency responses and getting this COVID money, being able to put a few more immediate emergency triage dollars into these programs, which is good. Most certainly we want that, but we want to be able to make it sustainable. When we look at those programs nationwide, when the ways in which they've been able to decrease violence in their communities and ways in which they've been able to lower the issues of crime in their communities, and they've done it on shoestring budgets, they've done it without really any substantial sustainability. We get to take all of this massive research, all of this stuff that we have learned, all of these different ways that it's been piloted in all these places, and we get to actually make it happen on a long term. And the reality is, again, as Steve Kramer mentioned, as a few people in the chat have mentioned, we're already doing these things. We've been doing these things, and here we still are. Like that's the reality. We're still like, we don't see it, we don't feel it. And we have to, again, get to the point where we're serious about concretely, positively changing the conditions of people who live in the city.
As I'm monitoring the, excuse me, yeah. As I'm monitoring the chat, I'm seeing some more kind of questions in this kind of genre. And I didn't hear from either of you, but correct me if I'm wrong, that there's been another city that has adopted the approach of not mandating a police department and the structure that you're proposing, that we can draw examples from. Now, Minnesota and Minneapolis have often been the path breakers, but I think there's some nervousness among some of the participants in tonight's Zoom about, can you point to an example that this has worked or clearly not worked, or are we going to be a path breaker if it's going to pass? Steve, you want to just offer any?
I was just going to comment on that, and I don't want this to come across as argumentative. I also want to point out that while you look your age, I don't. But for me, it's been 42 years working on this stuff. I think a concern for those of us who live in Minneapolis and care deeply about the city is that this effort is seen as an experiment. the resources for Yes for Minneapolis in their latest disclosure report came overwhelmingly from outside the state of Minnesota. And I think that for many people, it's, well, let's see if kind of a discretionary police department, what happens if that's the approach. I don't want to be an experiment. Folks that are funding this effort won't have to live with the consequences, but all of us and our neighbors, especially our neighbors of color in inner city neighborhoods, will. And I think that's a problem. I'm not aware of any other community that has had kind of an approach that says a law enforcement function as part of public safety is discretionary, which this amendment clearly says.
So, Janae, Steve kind of expanded his response to that. And there are a number of questions in the chat that speak to the funding of Yes for Minneapolis and the lack of and the debate over the charter language. I know that's kind of insider stuff, but since many of the participants are asking about it, would you like to kind of respond to that so that they have your perspective?
Yes, and I just wanted to go kind of to dig in a little bit more because Steve mentioned it too. Like, the fact is that many cities actually don't have the same structure at all as Minneapolis, and many of them don't put a number of officers, which is an arbitrary number. Nationwide, that number vastly differs. They don't put that in their city charter. They do that by ordinance, which is what the city of Minneapolis, what this charter change is proposing. So that's not actually drastically different from many cities, even cities larger than Minneapolis. So I want to say that. And then in regard to the budgeting, I'm sorry, can you say what the question is in regard to staffing and budgeting?
Oh, it was more about the controversy regarding the funding of the campaign.
Okay.
And the debate and litigation over the explanatory language. There's been several questions about that. So I thought it would be helpful to give you an opportunity to provide your perspective.
Sure. I will tell you the factual truth because we've been extremely transparent about our funding, and we've actually been really intentional about that. We made sure that the ways that we set up this campaign, because there's like these PACs, and there's certain PACs you can set up where you can hide your money or not have to reveal who the donors are. We were really intentional in wanting to be transparent, and so we most certainly have. We've raised a little over $1 million now, which we're really excited about, and we've gotten that nationwide, and also from thousands of small donors right here in Minneapolis. And so what we have been able to do through this particular campaign is get folks just as excited about being able to create a Department of Public Safety, create a mechanism for us to have a holistic, comprehensive Department of Public Safety that includes police, and we use them in smart, disciplined, strategic ways. And I also just really want to explicitly name again that this is a grassroots campaign, which it is largely, it's multiracial. It is also Black-led. And in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, as you all know, again, because we glorify the problem, we have stark, horrendous racial disparities in everything from healthcare to housing to wages. And so when you're talking about being Black-led, you're also talking about communities of color, BIPOC communities that have had our resources extracted and exploited for a long time. And so the fact that there are organizations and people, communities, families nationwide that said we want to make sure that these folks have the resources they need to sustain to November. We are really excited about that. We're excited that people want to put their money, their resources where their values are.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to offer any comments? And I'm not sure what the organized opposition is and whether there's a campaign for it. Do you know anything that would be helpful for the group to know about how that's being managed to the extent there is a organized effort?
Very much so. Totally in the spirit of transparency. And in Minnesota, I think a positive thing is it actually isn't possible to hide your sources of funds. Yes for Minneapolis had a campaign disclosure, another committee that's been formed called All of Minneapolis had a disclosure. There will be another one about a week before the election, so people actually can see where resources are coming from. And the All of Minneapolis disclosure, compared to Yes for Minneapolis in early August, the number was lower, but it just got started, so that number will grow. But 100% of those funds came from individuals or companies that are here in Minneapolis or have a tie to Minneapolis, compared to, I think the number was 82% of the disclosure from Yes Minneapolis. Yes for Minneapolis came from outside of the state. So a pretty big difference in terms of kind of the hometown team in terms of resourcing these campaigns versus folks that are kind of looking at what might happen here, but not having, as I said earlier, to live with the consequences of the potential decision here.
Yeah, thank you. So now I'd like to kind of shift, because there's many questions that speak to, well, if it were to be adopted, what would actually happen and how would it happen? So Janae, I'll ask you to address that. So let's say the amendment passes, your campaign is successful, but it's now it's the day after. What process would be utilized to, in your judgment, implement this amendment? And what are your kind of personal preferences on some of the key issues and some of those that are a part of your coalition? Because what I'm reading in the questions and reading is a little bit of the concern over the uncertainty. What will be response times? What about will this affect the number of kids who have been shot? Just that concern. So how will this specifically be implemented? Because I can see in the questions just, okay, what will really happen?
Yes. So these are great questions, and ones that you should absolutely be asking now, because you get to all be involved in that. If you live in the city of Minneapolis, you absolutely have a say and a voice in this. So what happens immediately, of course, after we all celebrate that we have finally did something tangible and concrete and amazing together, when Yes for Minneapolis is signed in, is that then there's an ordinance process. And that ordinance process will be community members. You will actually be able to talk to your elected leadership. And that actually has already begun. People have been contacting their elected officials, talking to their mayor, talking to their city council members, to be sure that, like, these are the things we absolutely need. You know, I have had so many conversations with so many folks about this. And just today, I was talking to a young lady who was talking about how this woman, Laura, in Loring Park, who had been in a domestic violence situation, and she already felt like she couldn't trust to really call the police. And then when she did, when she just really needed to be able to get some help, that they showed up in a way that wasn't actually helpful, that didn't make her feel more safe. And it wasn't until a school counselor got her the resources and help that she needs that actually, like, brought her true safety. And so folks like Laura, folks over north, folks in every single part of the city get to say, you know what, let's look at the statistics that we already have. Who are people calling 911 for? You know, even Chief Arredondo, when he was testifying in the murder of George Floyd against Derek Chauvin, he said the majority of calls that police receive should not actually be police responding. So let's look at those calls, and then let's make actual measured, smart decisions about how that the department gets staffed. But I mean, right away, like, just being grounded in reality, right away, the Department of Public Safety will be all police, because that's what we have right now. And then the community members get to staff it up. But certainly, I mean, if we just sign it over, the Minneapolis Police Department police will become the Department of Public Safety police. That's what happens.
So just a brief follow-up, then I'll ask for any comments by Steve. Do you know of anybody, or is your group actually working on the framework for an ordinance that would be a framework that the community could look at if this were to be adopted? Or how do you see that process working?
Yes, so there are organizations like Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota, the Minneapolis Federations of Teachers, the ACLU, Sierra Club. There's so many different organizations. I know folks really like to amplify Black visions and reclaim the Block, and I understand. But there's almost 50 organizations that are a part of this, and they have a vast different idea of what they want 10, 50, 60, 100 years from now in Minneapolis. But what they want today, tomorrow, next month, next year is for people to be safe. And they want to do that at a way that makes sense for the city every year, which right now, again, the current charter just doesn't allow that. And so what you get to do when you vote yes is that you get to move at the pace of the city. I hear a lot of people who are like, I'm really excited about this, and I am very excited that there will be a part of this department. And that is great, because that's the reality that we're in as well. And so people actually get to say, you know what, as it turns out, we need police for this thing. And it was way better that a sexual assault abuse responder came to me instead of an officer in this situation. Or it was really great that someone who was trained with dealing with folks who are experiencing homelessness than someone with a gun and a badge in this situation. We get to have those things. And so to just say no, we're just going to continue doing what we know doesn't work. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, thank you. Steve, same question to you. If it were to pass, do you believe that the point of view that you represent and those that are opposing it would argue that we just keep the status quo within the context of the ordinance as much as possible, or how would you proceed to work with it? And what other comments you might have in that space?
Tim, I'm worried about what happens next if this amendment passes. As I mentioned earlier, there's a statutory requirement that any charter amendment that is adopted be implemented within 30 days. So this notion that there will be this broad open process to try to define this very sketchy framework, I think runs afoul of that reality. So this current council, not even the one that's elected in November, would have to respond in some way within that 30-day period, and there really isn't a framework. To your point earlier, there may be people thinking about it, but it's not kind of all members of our community. So I do think there could be chaos. I think it could already make the situation that we face in our city from a safety standpoint even more challenging and difficult. And I do worry greatly about that implementation process. So I've likened this, kind of changing the name on the door of a company doesn't change the dynamics within the company. That's hard work. And I've likened this to, back in college, you write the term paper and you start with the title of the paper and you think you're done. No, you got to come up with the table of contents. You kind of come up with the paper, and that hasn't happened. We were promised, starting with that fateful afternoon in Powderhorn Park last June, that there would be significant engagement on all of these issues. Instead, what we've seen is utter polarization of our community and no effort to try to come together to find the right path forward. And I think this amendment is the ultimate manifestation of that, and the implementation of it, if it passes, will, I think, be quite challenging for our city.
Okay, thank you. So Steve, I'm going to ask you an unfair question now, and fair warning, Janae, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you were in Janae's shoes and arguing that point of view, what do you think the best arguments are for moving in the direction as a kind of neutral observer and one who is fair-minded? What do you think the best points they are making for their case?
The best argument is that, and I started my comments with the same observation, that the status quo is not acceptable, that we have to do better as a community. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, I did, as somebody who's been involved in this community for over 40 years, as I said, doing a lot of different jobs, a lot of self-reflection on, what I could have done better, what I could have done different to, make solve the conditions that led to the kind of righteous anger and uprising that we saw. So that's the best argument. We've got to do better. My only concern, my dire concern, is that this isn't the way to do better.
Janae, the same question. If you were to make Steve's case, what are the best points? And kind of what do you agree on? I think Steve is agreeing with you. The status quo is not acceptable. Where is that common ground?
Yeah, I think that I would absolutely agree that there are most certainly people like the police chief who has been really trying really hard, along with community partners, along with people across the city to really make this department do what we initially entrusted it to do. And so I absolutely agree that folks have the political will to get it done. I also think that we've gotten to the point after quite a few decades now where we have to have some political honesty about it's going to take more than what we've been doing. And so that is the reality of where we are. And so I'm most certainly, I know that Mr. Kramer and many of the folks here who maybe even already believe that they want to vote no. I really do believe that many of us, most of us, if not all of us, do want to be and feel safe and keep one another safe. I also think that we've been dragging our feet on that for a really long time. And if we want to actually get serious about this, then we have to take a real step forward and not just do these little incremental things that make us feel like we check the box. And it actually doesn't do anything demonstrably different for anyone in the city.
Okay, we're at 8:06 right now, so I'm going to ask one more question, give you each a couple of minutes to respond, and then make any concluding comments that you would like to make. And Janae, I will start with you since you started out. I will give Steve the last word, but the last word will be by the voters and what goes on between now and election day. So
yes.
Yes. So
yes.
If you are not successful, what will happen to Yes for Minneapolis? And my basic question is, will you stay at it and work with whomever the mayor and the council are? Will you work with the downtown council and community stakeholders for that continued improvement? Steve, that'll be a similar question. Would you work as well to keep advancing the discussion? Because I'm seeing some common ground here, but would you continue to work together? So in that context, and any final comments that you want to make, about 2 minutes.
Yes, absolutely. For many of folks on here probably do already know me, again, as you mentioned, with being with Isaiah and Faith in Minnesota. And so we're deeply embedded in the community, most certainly have been committed to these fights. We've been doing all kinds of work on the state level, and most certainly in the cities and in greater Minnesota to have real justice and accountability and transparency, but most certainly to keep everyone safe. And so we've continued that, and we definitely continue that with folks of goodwill who are ready to take steps forward. And so that is the most exciting thing about all this. And so, yeah, I just really want to name one thing that I think is really important. I just know that, there are people on here who are feeling like, yes, I want to vote yes, but I'm scared. And I just really want to remind you, I want you to think about it like this. Think about a person who has only ate rice their whole life. That's all they've had. That's all they've known, right? Their body has kind of gotten used to it, but they are drastically malnutritious. They're not malnutrition. They're not actually healthy, but they're making it. And then someone says, hey, if you say yes, I'll make sure you also get, some protein and vegetables and fruits. And then someone else says, but they're going to come and take all your rice. That is what's happening right now. We cannot let that lizard brain be activated this way. We cannot be so terrified to do something good that we're going to lose something. That doesn't mean we lose anything. This is not, we have to have an honest conversation about what we can have and be and create together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Steve, almost the last word for you. I'm going to have the last word to wrap up, but I'll give you a couple of minutes.
Great, thanks, Tim. I'll be quick. If the amendment passes, I suspect my days will be pretty full, as they were after the Powderhorn Park announcement, kind of explaining to people in the city and from all over the country, if not the world, what will this mean for Minneapolis? I think it will be very consequential and not in a positive way. Certainly within that 30-day period where some initial decisions have to be made per state statute, without much guidance because of the lack of a plan. Absolutely. The business community and others, I'm a long-term city resident as well, will be as engaged as we possibly can be. But I think those opportunities are going to be limited, quite honestly. So we'll do the best we can to make the best out of what will be, in my estimation, a very bad situation. And I think my concluding comment would simply be, I also don't want to come at this from a fear-based perspective. I mean, I know that Yes Minneapolis has a really good pollster, and I think they've probably poll tested fear mongering, because that comment comes up a lot in any kind of argument about opposing the amendment. But I think there are legitimate concerns based on current conditions in our city that need to change for the better for all of us, especially people of color, and the lack of any real concrete notion of how this plan would move forward if it passes. So I'm hoping that question 2 will be defeated, and that will open the door to more dialogue that we should have had over these past 17 months that we haven't had, about how to really move our community forward in a positive way from a safety standpoint for everybody.
Thank you. We've been at it for over an hour now, and I really want to, on behalf of everyone in the downtown and North Loop neighborhood associations, thank so much Janae and Steve for giving up their time to us this evening. I think we've all learned a lot, and also thank them for their involvement, for their rolling up their sleeves and being passionate about keeping a city and making a city better. I think we all just owe them whatever kind of applause that we can give them. And I think obviously this is a complicated and sometimes emotional issue. And I hope that we all pay attention as this election unfolds, learn more, think more, get involved, and of course, vote. And so that is the last word. Get involved, get smart, and vote, because it's our democracy. And it's our obligation to keep it. So with that, I will conclude the evening. Reminder that this is being recorded and will be available on the organization's website, and I'm sure it'll be around in various media over the next several hours and days. Thank you again, and good evening.